Dr. Dan Plews here, back on the Physical Performance Show, this time talking about the low carbohydrate diet and the right fuel, right time approach.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to episode 352 of the award-winning Physical Performance Show. Today's episode is brought to you by Polar's stunning new watch, the Ignite 3, and Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. Of course, we do this across a range of our different episodes: interest editions, coaches' corners, learnings, catch-up episodes, featured performers, and expert editions. And today, you are in for a real treat with return guest of the show, our much-loved and acclaimed sports scientist, Dr. Dan Plews. Now, this is Dan's fourth appearance on the Physical Performance Show, with archived episodes including episode 213, Heat Training and Acclimation for the Endurance Athlete, episode 256, High Intensity Interval Training for the Endurance Athlete, and then earlier this year, episode 318, Heart Rate Variability Guided Endurance Training. Now, on this fourth appearance from Dr. Dan Plews, we explore low carbohydrate fueling, right time, right approach. Now, you are going to learn a lot from Dr. Dan Plews today. By way of brief bio, Dr. Dan Plews is a world acclaimed scientist, applied exercise physiologist, and long course triathlon coach, having just coached the current 2022 Ironman world champion Chelsea Sodaro to victory, and himself having the world age group record for the Hawaii Ironman World Championship Triathlon race, set in 2018, a blistering 8:24, a record that stands to this day. Scientifically, Dr. Plews has over 30 peer-reviewed publications to his name and has worked with more than 25 world and Olympic title-winning athletes across a variety of sports. Now, I recently spent time with Dr. Dan Plews out in New Zealand at the Endure IQ headquarters alongside his athlete, Javier Gomez, and our discussion turned, at times, to this topic: how does a long-course triathlete best optimise their fat oxidation whilst doing it safely to ensure daily energy requirements are met? And what are the upsides to this approach? Well, I watched Dan train in person, and he lives and breathes this. The results speak for themselves. So get ready with your pen and paper for a whole lot of learnings from Dr. Dan Plews. Now, before we jump in, the team at Endure IQ have generously offered up a great offer to listeners of this episode. Endure IQ have some wonderful full-length online courses around all topics pertaining to success in long-course triathlon. Now, there's a whole course devoted to the topic of our conversation today: low carbohydrate lifestyle, right time, right approach. It's called the LTD 101 course. Now, if you use the code ENDUREIQ-TPPS, that's all capitals, ENDUREIQ-TPPS, Dan and the team are generously offering you free access to LTD 201, which is a course devoted to heart rate variability. Now, I've done LTD 201. It's a wonderful course. So this is a great deal from the team. So if you're interested in learning more about today's topic, jump over to Endure IQ, use the code ENDUREIQ-TPPS, and take advantage of that great offer. All of the courses from Endure IQ are accredited by USA Triathlon, the American College of Sports Medicine, and the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. And I should flag, there is no commercial interest with the Physical Performance Show and Endure IQ. It's just a great product, a great educational resource that I know can help many people. So let's jump in with Dr. Dan Plews. Dr. Dan Plews, welcome back to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks for having me back, Brad. It's nice that, now that I've actually met you in person, it's even a better vibe than normal.
Yeah, it was only a few weeks ago that I was there at Endure IQ headquarters, just outside of Auckland, with yourself and your athlete Javier. And it's bizarre. 10 years of courtship, and the first time we'd met in flesh.
The broma. It's like when you left. My wife Kate said, "You two have got a bit of a bromance now, haven't you?" And I went, "Yeah, the bromance is real."
Well, that was a great time, and the conversation. And I asked you a few questions about this topic when we spent a few days together there around fueling for performance, for health. Specifically endurance performance, and it's a topic you've been our resident expert physiologist on the show, alongside I guess Dr. Stephen Seiler and others. We've explored themes prior such as heat acclimation. We've explored heart rate variability, high intensity interval training, but the fueling conversation was one that I'd avoided or dodged with you, not because I wasn't interested, but I was trying to wrap my head around how on earth it would fit to the endurance community, who, if anything, at times can be quite underfueled. So we're going to dive into it. And the tipping point for me, Dan, was doing almost a 4-hour ride with yourself and Javier over there, and looking at how you went about fueling yourself through that, which was very different to what I had typically observed people doing across a 4-hour ride. So let's jump into it. Dan, obviously, people think of your coaching. You've just coached Chelsea Sodaro to the Ironman 2022 Kona Championship title. So firstly, congratulations on that.
Thanks very much.
And a breakthrough performance for Chelsea. But people think of Dan Plews, and I think they do think of this low-carb, high-fat approach. But it's not that simple, is it? There's a lot more to it than just a label. Maybe we can just start with a bit of basic physiology around fueling and different substrates that fuel training and performance.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So, I definitely have that tag and that title, but I was actually speaking to someone at the Collins Cup about it, and I don't really think it's fully justified, because I like with my pros, for example, I don't do any kind of low carbohydrate diet. I do take a right fuel, right time approach, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But the requirement, like Jan van Berkel, he does a low carb diet. But like Chelsea, Javier, Pablo, they do not. And it's all around choices and what works for the athlete at the time. And most elites, for reasons that we'll talk about, they don't need it as much as amateurs do. When it comes to exercise physiology and particularly endurance exercise, we can have 3 fuels. We can use protein as a fuel, but we don't really do that. We use it very sparingly. We do that very sparingly. But the 2 main fuels that everyone knows about is we use carbohydrates via glycolysis and then oxidative phosphorylation, which most people will know as the Krebs cycle. And then we also use fats through beta oxidation. And that also goes into the Krebs cycle, and that's how we produce ATP, how we produce energy. Very, very simply, fats the requirement of burning fats uses a little bit more oxygen than the requirement of burning carbohydrates. And so we're all led to believe, therefore, that fats are at least the least superior fuel, because they're not as efficient for us to use. When it comes to very, very long distance exercise, that to me is the absolute key distinction. So when I talk about this, I'm always talking through the lens of long distance triathlon, really. 70.3 to some extent, but I'm more thinking Ironman, so 8 hours of exercise, where a determinant of success is the preservation of endogenous or internal carbohydrate stores. And that's like the key distinction for me. And we know that, in terms of what we can store in terms of our body for carbohydrates, it's about 1,500 to 2,000 calories in the liver and in the muscle. But then when it comes to fats, even the very leanest of individuals, someone as lean as yourself, Brad, can store 40,000 calories of fat. So therefore, when we talk about hitting the wall and we talk about running out of energy, is what we call metabolically inflexible or unflexible. And we're looking for metabolic flexibility, where how can you be running out of energy and bonking when you still have that much fat that can be used as an energy source available to you? And if you can ramp up your fat oxidation to a very substantial amount, you can still go very, very fast. You can, I think the calculations are you can run about a 2:40 marathon on fat alone. The reason to run out of energy isn't really there. It's more of a fact that you can't access the fuel. And I always liken it to a fuel tanker going down the highway, and that fuel tanker has petrol in its engine, and it's going down, and it's got the fuel in the back. But every time the engine runs out of fuel, it has to stop, fill it with fuel at the petrol station, and keep on going. But the difference is that if you become fat adapted, all you're doing is you're getting the pipe and you're sticking it right into the fuel tank, and you're opening yourself up to more ability to burn fuels.
Gosh, that's, I think, got the ears of everyone listening in, particularly what you just said there, Dan. How is it possible to run out of energy, to hit the wall, to bonk, when there's still so much fuel on board?
Exactly. I mean, we had one of our athletes, Matt Kerr, I know who you know. We measured him in the lab, and his fat oxidation rates were at 1.8 grams per minute, one of the highest one of the highest I've ever seen, and I think one of the highest recorded ever. And so, to put that into perspective, even at 300 watts, he was predominantly using fat as a fuel. That's absolutely crazy. So now you imagine when he's in an Ironman and he's down at 270, 280 watts, how much carbohydrate he's preserving just because he's using so much fat to fuel that power output.
Dan, going back to some of those earlier comments, you said it's not necessarily for everyone. Like, of all the professional athletes that you coach, Jan van Berkel, Javier Gomez, Chelsea Sodaro, Jan van Berkel is a proponent of the fat adaptation, and you wrote a great blog on Endure IQ about Jan's journey. Can you just touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I've written 2 blogs on Jan. One was basically looking at it from a health perspective, because I do believe that lowering your carbohydrate intake for most people is a healthier way to live, just because you have lower blood glucose, and it's more lower and more stable blood glucose. But one of the things that we found with Jan, bearing in mind this is a very elite athlete who has very low levels of adipose fat. So, like, the fat that's the subcutaneous fat that we all see is very low, but his visceral fat from going on a low-carb diet reduced by 45%. And visceral fat's the fat that you want to be most concerned about from a health perspective. So fat around the organs, which is visceral fat, is way worse than fat in the adipose tissue. And so, you've got an athlete who we all deem to be really fit and healthy, but yet by shifting his diet, he made massive improvements in his overall health. And that, if you went to any doctor and you said, I reduced my visceral fat by 45%, the doctor would be like, wow, that is an amazing outcome. So that was one blog that I wrote on Jan, and that was in the very, very early days, but we actually just gave a bit of a repost and a republish. And then the other one was just looking at the lab data. So as you say, you can go into the lab, you can measure, like an exercise physiology lab, and you can measure expired VO2 and VCO2. And from that up to a certain, around 75, 80% of VO2 max, you get a very good idea of what your substrate use is. You can, from the expired air, through those changes, then you can kind of you can calculate, okay, how many grams of carbs would I need per hour to match my demand, so to speak. And Jan reduced his carbohydrate intake requirement by 21 gels over the course of an Ironman.
Wow, 21 gels.
I think that was the bike as well. 21 gels over the course of the Ironman bike only.
Obviously, Jan had a tough day out at the Ironman World Championships this year with an injury, but just had a great race only a week or two ago. I think a week ago at the time of this recording, to pick up a podium.
Yeah, and I think it goes to show, I think even like with Chelsea and lots of my Ironman athletes, I'm even, with Chelsea, we do the right fuel, right time approach. So that means she's typically not on a low carb diet, but we do some manipulation of carbohydrates around sessions. So some of our lower intensity long sessions will do a bit of glycogen depletion before and limit the amount of carbohydrates she's having during, and then refuel after, keeping the carbohydrates higher for the high intensity sessions. But she's not on a more chronic low carb diet. But, all the athletes that I typically coach, they were always very good at the back end of the run, particularly Jan. I mean, Jan was 11 minutes down on the back of the coming off the bike, and he ran his way into second, because basically because he's not running out of fuel, right? He's tapping into his fat metabolism so well. And even when I won Kona in 2018, I won the age group. I looked at some stats of that, and even me myself, bearing in mind I'm an amateur and I'm nowhere near the level of the pros, but my run split was the fifth fastest of the day, and in the last mile it was only Patrick Langer who was running faster than me. So I didn't slow down at all, really. So I mean these are some of the big differences that you can start to see.
And that was your 8:24, which is still the Ironman World Championship age group record from 2018. Has it just been your years in the field as an applied scientist and also obviously an academic and coach, of course, that sort of shaped your view on this, just looking at the physiology, like just realising that, well, as you say, we shouldn't be bonking if there's 40,000 calories of fat.
Yeah, exactly. And don't get me wrong, I've come full circle with this because I've been an exercise physiologist and athlete for far longer than I've been a proponent of this diet. I really only started getting into it in 2012. And, I was under the same impression that carbohydrates are the key. I would, probably 80% of my diet was carbohydrates. But in 2018, Professor Tim Noakes started talking about this very topic, and that kind of spiked my interest. And through a lot of self-experimentation, trying ketogenic diets, going very, very low, and I kind of found the right approach that I think is key, because the devil is in the detail. It's not just a case of dropping your carbs below 50 grams per a day and hoping for the best. It's about finding the right level for you and moving that around the training.
You mentioned Tim Noakes there. In preparation for this, I went back and listened to an episode from 4 years ago that we featured with Dr. Peter Bruckner, acclaimed Australian sports physician, who wrote the book A Fat Lot of Good, about his own journey from pre-type 2 diabetes to markedly reducing his cardiovascular risk profile and changing his life from being pre-obese to lean and mean, so to speak. And Peter was influenced by Tim Noakes as well. That's what pricked Peter's ears up about this.
Yeah. I mean, Tim Noakes, he's one of my academic heroes, and I think he's such an amazing scientist, and he's also, I wouldn't say ridiculed, but people challenge him a lot, but most of the time he's right. He's a very good researcher, and and when he says something, I'll always pay attention at least and look into it myself a little bit more. And now this was certainly the case with the low carb diet. I thought, that's interesting that Tim Noakes is talking about this. He doesn't just normally bring these things up for no good reason. So yeah, and at the time I was, who's been on the show, Paul Lawson, we were living close to one another, and we kind of went on the journey together. And we both started experimenting, and Paul ended up he went under 10 hours for an Ironman for the first time in about 10 attempts, after hitting the low carb diet. So for him, it was a real game changer at 40 years old. So
the bit that I struggle to sort of comprehend is there's a whole, I guess, market built around carbohydrate fueling for the endurance athlete. How have we found ourselves here where really we only look to gels and carbohydrate solutions for our biddens, our water bottles, to get us through a race?
Like I said at the start, I think it's important to understand that, if I was coaching a 5K runner or a 1500 meter runner, I wouldn't be I wouldn't be going for the type of aggressive approach or promoting the aggressive approach that I do with a lot of my long distance triathletes, because it's just not a determinant of success. And if you look at Ironman triathlon, there's a great paper that was published by, I think it was a Swedish group, that looks, okay, what are the determinants of success for Ironman triathlon? VO2 max was one of them. Efficiency was another. And fat oxidation was the other one. So those three things are really important. So immediately, then if you're looking at training your VO2 max, you're looking at training your efficiency, then why aren't we paying attention to the fat oxidation? And if you follow general guidelines that you have to be well carbed up all the time. You have to always be taking gels every, 60 grams every hour or whatever when you're exercising to keep your fuel up. You will never, ever get to the position where you're using fat as a fuel and you therefore upregulate your fat oxidation. So it's context before content. It's the context of what you're looking at through the lens. It's like, if it's important, then you have to train it. You can't just ignore it. And I think that most people and most of the advice we get is not thinking about the context of the sport that we're doing. I mean, there's a lot of famous research, that people obviously cite that say, low carbohydrate diet doesn't work, and it's it's always done in like 10-kilometer race walkers or very, very short distances. And of course it doesn't work. I mean, it's not a requirement of success. It's as much use as going, here we go, we're going to do a training study on improving your bench press and see if it improves your Ironman performance. Of course it's not going to, because being good at bench press is not a requirement of doing well at an Ironman. So I think it's really important to understand the context of the sport and understand the determinants of success of the sport when you are considering the type of dietary interventions that you're undergoing.
So it's reverse engineering respective of the demands of the sport. And we're talking, say, long course triathlon here, which is a war of attrition. Like you say, you mentioned there, Dan, your 2018 Kona performance, second fastest last mile of the race, fifth fastest marathon of the day. And I heard you mention prior, on that day in your Ironman performance, that world record day, your swim was, I think, around the 15th fastest swim for the age groupers, and
slower than that. Yeah, it was more than that. I think it was like 40th or something. Yeah.
And your bike was, in your words, sort of, average, but your run was simply outstanding.
Yeah, the run was the thing that kind of made the day, really. Yeah.
So reverse engineering. You said that if you're having gels all the time through training, you just simply can't improve your fat oxidation. Is that just because, Dan, you're preferentially going to use the carbohydrate because there's a lower metabolic requirement to?
Yeah, exactly. So it goes into the blood glucose. It doesn't go into the muscle. That's one thing that people don't. Many people think that when we're taking on carbohydrates during exercise, we're basically stopping the muscle glycogen depletion. But the research is pretty clear on that. That when we consume carbohydrates during exercise, we're not stopping the depletion of muscle glycogen. We're restoring liver glycogen. And therefore, the liver glycogen is really, really important to maintain blood glucose. Blood glucose causes fatigue, so drops in blood glucose and becoming hyperglycemic causes a lot of fatigue. So that's what the gels are doing. The question is, that's what about if we're taking carbohydrates during exercise. Yes and no. It depends on the duration. So we actually published a paper in the Journal of Sports Medicine that showed that exercise duration is a real key driver of fat metabolism. So the longer you go, the more you drive up fat metabolism. So basically, after an hour and a half, 2 hours, you can take a gel and it's not going to drive down your fat metabolism. But if you're going in fully fueled, massive, you're carbo loading before, you're taking carbohydrates just before, you're eating a lot the night before, you're then fueling all the way through, then you're never giving yourself the ability to upregulate your fat oxidation, which I think is really important to help with that. I mean, in this paper that we published, we showed that one of the greatest drivers of fat oxidation during exercise is habitual diet. So that means having a lower carb diet and having more fat in your diet is really important. And exercise duration is also really important, as I mentioned, and also muscle glycogen. So generally, the lower our muscle glycogen at the start of exercise, the better our fat oxidation. But doesn't mean to say that we want to start a race with low levels of muscle glycogen. Of course not. But there might be specific times, if you're not on a low carbohydrate diet generally, that you might want to reduce muscle glycogen a little bit before you do a longer session. So one of the things that I often do with my pros is that the ones who aren't on a lower carbohydrate diet will look at, say, they've got a big ride on a Wednesday, a long, low intensity ride. And I'm thinking, okay, this is one of the outcomes of this ride is that we want to promote our substrate use. We want to promote fat oxidation. We'll train the Tuesday night. That night, we'll purposely refrain from replenishing carbohydrates. So it'll just be proteins and fats for dinner. Obviously, lots of calories still. In the morning, again, we'll just have like protein and fats for before the ride, and then during the ride, you refrain from carbohydrates until you can kind of tolerate it. So 2.5 to 3 hours, then you might take some in at that point, depending on the individual. As you know, when I rode, I didn't take anything on. I just had in the morning, I had a coffee and an S Fuels bar, which is no carbohydrates, and then I didn't take on one carb.
No, it was, and I hadn't ridden 4 hours since May, so 6 months prior. And I was a little bit nervous, so I was looking to just take anything I could. But and I was watching you. You had one bidden for the whole 4 hours as well.
Yeah.
And I was like, right, okay, you've got my attention. And not only did we do the 4 hour ride, you then got off and ran a 1 hour hard, relatively, intense run with about 400 or 500 meters of elevation, and I couldn't even keep up with you on the mountain bike. So
I think that's one thing that we should talk about, because when it comes to racing, I don't race this way. And that's why the devil is in the detail. And Endure IQ, we wrote a course, LDT 101. We now had more than 1,000 people through that course. It's one of our most popular courses, and we've had so much success. Like the success stories of people changing their lives, changing the way that they race, because the course is something that I'm quite proud of. And, because when it comes to racing, of course, you do a bit of a carbo load before, you make sure your liver glycogen's topped up, and you also take carbohydrates during as well. It's not like you're limiting your carbohydrates all the way through and then eating avocados and MCT oil during the race, because I never say that carbohydrates are the enemy. In fact, I'm saying the opposite, really, because I'm promoting the preservation of carbohydrate during racing. And that's what you can do. It's always two sides to the coin. You can either improve your fat oxidation, or you can increase your carbohydrate intake during racing. What I promote and what I think is the best and the safest way particularly for age groupers, is go moderate on the carbohydrates during racing and improve your fat oxidation.
So I assume that improving your carbohydrate intake, this is where there seems to be a race on how many grams of carbohydrates athletes can now ingest per hour, and there's certain numbers being thrown out, and various athletes and camps that sort of coaching outfits that talk about, pretty huge numbers, the professional cycling peloton, greater than 100 grams an hour, etc., with the view that you can train your gut to be able to tolerate that high level of carbohydrate ingestion while you're exercising. What's your view on that? I've heard you state in person when we've had a conversation that there's a very real ceiling, and many people don't necessarily need to go anywhere near those numbers, particularly age group athletes.
It's a great that's a great statement. And one of the things you said there is you can increase your ability to tolerate the carbohydrates, and that's true for sure. So you can train your gut, you can train yourself to tolerate more carbohydrates when you exercise. But what you're not doing is you're not improving your ability to oxidize the carbohydrates. So that means that even though you're tolerating them and you're taking them in, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going anywhere. They're pretty much just sitting in the gut, and you're tolerating them sat in the gut. They're not actually really improving performance, so to speak. I mean, of course, there are a few freaks out there, the very, very elites, who might be able to oxidize more. But generally, most people can only tolerate about 90 grams per hour if it's in a mixture of fructose and glucose. But the problem is many people are intolerant to fructose. So this is where the GI distress. And one of the things that I noticed personally, and you'll probably feel the same, is I think there's three major pinch points for any Ironman athlete, particularly age group Ironman athletes. Number one is when I'm stood on the sideline of an Ironman triathlon, many people just have the bonking, they run out of energy, which we've already talked about. Number two is there is so much GI distress. People stomach problems on the side of the street, bent over, going to the medical tent because they just can't, they're just taking in too much carbohydrates, or they have that general GI distress, which still to this day is the number one reason for DNF during ultra distance triathlon. And number 3 is that, like, body composition. Most athletes struggle to maintain a normal body composition or a stable body composition all year round. And many of them, despite training 20 hours a week, still look like a normal person who doesn't do any exercise. And it's because of the effects of the carbohydrate on the insulin, on the fatty, and the storage of fat, and the amount of carbohydrates in the diet. And I think being more mindful and going for a lower carbohydrate approach, not a ketogenic approach, can actually mitigate and solve all those 3 major problems for many, many athletes.
Gosh, 3 pinch points, bonking, GI distress, which I think most people listening in, including myself, have observed and experienced. And then the body composition, where despite up to 20 hours plus of training a week, people don't necessarily look like they're in good energy balance with super leanness and with a lean composition, I should say. And then you said after that, Dan, it's not about necessarily a full ketogenic approach. It's a lower carbohydrate approach, and I think that's a key distinction. Yeah,
it's a very key distinction, and like that's what we in our course and in Endure IQ, like that's the thing that we are very clear about. Is it's not about just trying to be in ketosis all the time and measuring your ketones every day. It's about we call it the sweet spot. So, it's still very individual. The level of carbohydrates per day is individual to the athlete. And so in the course, we talk about measuring your blood glucose and measuring your heart rate variability and also your performance, and using that as a proxy measure to kind of find the right phase or the right amount of carbohydrates for you. We start at 130. Some people who are a bit insulin resistant will need to go lower than that. People who are training a lot may go a bit higher than that, but it usually ranges somewhere between 100 and 200 grams, depending on the person. But it's about finding, we call it the sweet spot. But we do have we call it the cold keto period, where there is a phase where you kind of do 3 weeks of being very low in the carbohydrates specifically, just to try and boost your ketones. And also because most of us, we never produce ketones anymore because we don't need to. So it's just about getting yourself into the ability to produce, get into ketosis, produce ketones, which are really important for going longer because they can fuel the brain. They're actually the preferred fuel from the heart and the muscle above glucose. They're not a preferred fuel for the brain, but they are for the heart and muscle. So it's really important to be able to produce those and not experience bonking, because if you can produce ketones quite effectively, generally you won't bonk as much, and you won't feel the low energy depletion, particularly during those longer rides.
So it's a 3-week keto period of intentional.
Yeah, intentional. Yeah, but it's not. So it's a 3-week period where intentionally trying to get into ketosis, and so it's less than 50 grams a day. It's quite hard, it's not that easy, but it's a very important phase. One of the questions I often get when people doing the course is, do I really have to do the cold keto phase? But I'm like, yeah, you do. I mean, people, that's just the modern era of most people. They just hate suffering, right? So sometimes you got to suffer. You got to suck it up.
You got to jump in the ice bath fully immersed.
Yeah, exactly. People are all too. Everyone likes being comfortable too much. That's the problem.
Dan, if I think about my professional working life as a sports-based physio, working a lot in endurance sports, typically dealing with either tendon issues or bone stress issues or joint-related concerns, and particularly the bone stress-prone athlete who unfortunately often can battle through like boom-bust cycles of repeat bone stress injuries. And we know that one of the key drivers there is underfueling or a lack of caloric intake, either intentional or unintentional, which can heighten the risk sixfold for an athlete. And if they happen to have low bone density, which there's a high prevalence in the endurance sporting community of that, the risk can be up to 15 times greater So one of the things that I've sort of always been mindful of is, right, if you take carbohydrates out of the diet of an athlete like that, which is like myself, I've had repeat bone stress injuries, unfortunately, for many years. I'm trying to rewrite the my path forwards, but it's not a matter that their risk might be heightened. It's just a matter of they have to supplement or exchange the carbohydrate intake with other sources of calories.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think there's a few mistakes a lot of athletes can make when it comes to the approach, and I understand that relative energy deficiency is, of course, is a concern. And one of the things is fat is quite satiating, right? So many people, they get very full up with fat. So and also, especially if you're in ketosis, which is why we don't promote ketosis, because ketones are an appetite suppressor, which is why so many people lose so much weight when they're on a ketogenic diet, because ketones suppress appetite. You don't want to eat so much, and therefore you lose weight. So you actually, as an athlete, you don't want to be in ketosis because one is you suppress your appetite, which you don't want, and two, you have to be a bit restrictive of protein for most, because of gluconeogenesis. So we produce carbohydrates through proteins, and that will not allow you to go into ketosis. And then also, in order to be in ketosis, one of the first things that needs to happen is your liver needs to be empty of glycogen. So now think about trying to do long racing when you're in perform well with empty liver glycogen, which is in physiology is the way that we stabilize our blood glucose. And blood glucose stabilization is primary driver for fatigue. So there's a number of reasons why you shouldn't be in ketosis, really, prolonged or deliberate through diet. Athletes will always be in ketosis, in a cyclical ketosis, if you're a bit more diligent in how you partition your food. So if you do a long ride and you're a bit restrictive of the carbohydrates during and before, you will be in exercise-induced ketosis if you have given yourself the ability to produce ketones and you've kind of trained yourself to do it. Which is, like when I did that ride with you when you were here, I would have definitely been in ketosis by the end of that ride, 100%. Because I would have had exercise-induced ketosis. I would have upregulated the triglycerides in the blood and the fatty acids, which upregulate the ketosis. So I would have definitely been in ketosis. So that's kind of the one side of it. But then I also think people who go on the low carbohydrate diet, low carbohydrate diet, it kind of comes in this bubble for some reason of protein restriction. And one of the things that we have in our course is we describe the reasons and why you shouldn't be restricting protein. And in fact, if anything, you should increase your protein requirements when you're on a lower carbohydrate diet, because of just the turnover of the muscle and of course the bone as well. And that was shown in some great, I can't remember the author now. I was going to look it up before we had this conversation and I forgot to, but we wrote a little video blog on a paper that showed that lower carbohydrates require more protein. So I think keeping protein on the high level is important. I think it's like 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day is the range. But then also, and this is the main one, Brad, is that we've just been so driven in our mentality to have this fat phobia. And that's the main problem, is that when people try to make the shift, underlying all that is still a bit of a fat phobia. So they're scared of fat and then they kind of avoid it a little bit. And you just can't do that, because if you have a fat phobia, you're reducing your carbohydrates and you're kind of worried about protein, then you get in a real pickle, because how are you going to manage any type of energy balance? Because in reality, how can you argue that that you're going to be in a negative energy balance and you're lacking calories when there's 9 calories per gram of fat and there's 4 grams of calories per gram of carbohydrate? If you're diligent enough with your fat intake, many people who can easily go overboard on it, and they actually end up putting on weight with a low carb diet because they go crazy on the nuts and the cheeses, add oil to this, they're doing bulletproof coffees. So, but it's just about finding the right balance. And then last is, I think there's a bit of a drive with low carbohydrate athletes to do a lot of fasted workouts. And I don't think that's necessary. You should be fueling during exercise. And that's why at S Fuels, we brought out the Train product, which I was drinking when I was with you, which is kind of more of a fat-based fuel. And also eating protein and fat before, nothing, not going completely fasted. So there's so many little caveats that are really important to reduce any risk, right, of relative energy deficiency.
And it's such a big topic, and I do appreciate, Dan, that you've just shared a couple of the misnomers or the mistakes, such as lots of fasted workouts with a low carb approach versus still fueling for the sessions, but just with an alternate fuel source. And then, as you mentioned, if there's less carbs and greater fat intake, there is that greater caloric density with fats. So, it's not that you necessarily will be immediately by default in an energy deficit if you do reduce carbs, as long as there is perhaps a greater intake of fat. And I saw you taking a lot of fat, Dan. I saw yourself and Kate slow cooking up a slow cooker full of animal fat, boiling it down. And I said, "What's that?"
And I went, "It's fat." But things like that, adding fat to fuel and adding fat to your foods and things like this is really, really important. I mean, we published a paper that was in the International Journal of Sports Nutrition, and we actually did an experimental study where we tried to answer that very question, because there's this idea that the best way to promote fat oxidation during exercise is to do it fasted. So we did a study. It was a crossover study. So one person came in and did the same type of exercise. So they came in one time, they had carbohydrates before it. They came in another time, they just had protein before it. And they came in another time and they were fasted. And the exercise was, we did basically a step test to look at fat oxidation. And then we did 6 3-minute reps all out. But so 3 were clamped at threshold and then 3 were maximal. So there's as best effort as you could get. And the interesting thing about the study was there was no difference in performance. So fasted, carbohydrates, or protein, there was no difference in how well you executed those 3 minutes. But the big difference and the big take home from the study was that fasted and protein in terms of fat oxidation were pretty much the same. So there was really no difference in fat oxidation between those two. But when you took a lot of carbohydrates before, your fat oxidation was really blunted. So from that, I've kind of changed my tune, and now I push my athletes to take, just a good protein source, like a protein bar, like S Fuels Life Bar is what I have. I gave you one of those just before you left. That's pretty much what I have before nearly every workout. I have that in a coffee, and it's perfect. A good amount of fats, a bit of protein, and you're away. And
I did have one of those bars. It was different. It was very oily and quite chewy, but neutral in taste. There was nothing, really to it other than just a different sort of texture than to what I was used to. But I was prepared to give it a try, Dan. And you mentioned S Fuels there, Dan, and those that follow you know of you, and some of your athletes, see S Fuels now around the logo, and Hayden Wild, obviously doing very well across the shorter distances, an S Fuels athlete. What's the backstory there with your involvement, and how does it differ to what else is around commercially? And this is not an advertisement or a paid advertisement for S Fuels.
I'm on the board at S Fuels. I'm the technical advisor. Yeah, I'm a big part of the company. But it was founded by Leighton Phillips and his wife Nicole. And Leighton got in touch with me back in 2017 after I wrote that blog on Yan and the visceral fat. And, he talked to me and said, "Oh, I really like your blog." And at the time I was doing a low carbohydrate diet, but it becomes like, we talked about REDs and we talked about those problems, and the issue that you have is that there was nothing that you could really take during exercise. It was a question of either you have water or you have nothing. So then you do, if you're wanting to do kind of a low carbohydrate lifestyle and you wanted to restrict carbohydrates during exercise, there was literally nothing you could eat, because it's all, as we all know, it's massively carbohydrate dependent, and everything's laced and crammed in carbohydrates. So Leighton was developing S Fuels, and I was like, this is really interesting. So we started off with the fat-based products, which was what we have, the Train formula, which is like a sports drink that's basically MCT, collagen, and zero carbohydrates, and the Life bars. But now our portfolio is, we recognize the need for carbohydrates, of course. So we have, we take this right fuel, right time approach. Of course, we're very popular with low carb, with athletes who choose to do the low carb lifestyle, but we're definitely not pigeonholing ourselves into that. It's more the right fuel, right time approach. If you wanting to do a long ride, and you don't necessarily need to be taking in loads of carbohydrates, and nor is it necessarily that good for your health, and isn't necessarily that good for your metabolic flexibility. So the idea is that we have the options of fuels around your lifestyle, so what we call our life range. When we talked about the importance of habitual fat content in the diet to regulate fat oxidation, so we have Keto 3, which is our breakfast cereal. We have Transform, which my kids love. Put it in their porridge in the morning, make the pancakes with it. And then we have our train formulas, which is the life bars for the training, and our sports mix. But then we also have some higher carbohydrates, which is made on it's very fast releasing. It's a highly branched cyclic maltodextrin, which is a special formula that we've developed with a little bit of MCT. So it's absorbed really, really fast into the gut, but it's really for high intensity exercise and racing. Just a normal carbohydrate.
So there's a whole product range which is based around this philosophy of right fuel, right time.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it's not just a case of you have to, depending on the training type that you're doing, you will shift your fuel. So I'll give an example. So yesterday I did a 140K on the bike, and it included some intervals at just above Ironman pace, like 40-minute reps. And then I got off and I ran 15K at 350 pace. So it was a pretty decent session. So just all above my Ironman pace. So before it, I had like a coffee with S Fuels bar. And then during the ride, I had 2 bottles. In my first bottle, I had our Train product, which is just a fat-based fuel with some Prime, which is a bit of caffeine. So that's our Prime, which is our kind of a caffeinated product, which I had in the bottle. And I pretty much solely drank that for the first 3 hours, 15 minutes. Then my other bottle, I had our Race Plus product, which I only put about 20 grams of carbs in there. So then I switched over to that for the last bit before I got off the bike. And then when I got off the bike, I got home, I had 1.5 scoops of our Race Plus gel, which becomes as about 30 grams of carbs. So I quickly had that before the run, quick releasing, got onto the run, and then I just had water during the run, finished the run. So it's kind of like, it's not just that I started with carbohydrates and I had carbohydrates all the way through. I was kind of, as time went on, I moved into carbohydrates, and then I took a little bit more carbohydrates, fast releasing just before the run, and that is the right fuel, right time approach.
Preserving your carbohydrate stores.
Yeah, and upregulating your fat oxidation in the early stages,
which does mirror physiology across a long distance event.
Yeah.
Just getting a little bit more granular, if we may, on the how-tos. Let's say someone's listening in, they can recognize the paradigms that you're sharing, that they're acknowledging that this has a place, but maybe one of their pushbacks is the complexity or the perceived complexity of it, as opposed to a bricks and mortar get out, take your gels on training.
And I think that's the biggest obstacle that we face. We really, part of what we do, like the reason that Endure IQ and S Fuels, we're a cohesive team, we're together in all this, is because we realize there is such an educational part to getting it right. So that's why we have the courses at Endure IQ that teach you how to do it properly. But then we also have like quick start guides and a lot of educational material that's just involved in S Fuels as well. So there's I guess if people are really interested, go over to S Fuels, download the quick start guide. That's the best starting point. And then of course we've got our courses at Endure IQ as well to kind of take it to the next step.
Yeah, and this is not a paid advert for the Endure IQ courses either. I have done several of them though myself, and do highly recommend them. What are the mistakes that you see people making? Like, say, the top 3 mistakes you see people making when they try and now optimize their fat oxidation.
I think it's trying to chase ketogenesis is a real big one. People think that they have to be ketogenic, and they chase being in ketosis. And we published a study that looked at it was a 12-week very low carbohydrate study. And it basically looked at the effects of doing high intensity interval training on a low carbohydrate diet. Which by the way, there was no loss in the ability to do high intensity interval training on a low carbohydrate diet over a 12-week period. There was after 2 to 3 weeks, but after that, they kind of came right and they were totally fine. But ketones were one of the interesting things about that study is that we obviously tightly regulated the amount of carbohydrates that they were having during that period of time. And even though it was kept the same, ketones would progressively go down over time. And that's just because we get better at producing carbohydrates naturally from gluconeogenesis and even from triglycerides and the glycerol molecules associated with that and producing carbohydrates from many other sources. And we obviously become better fat burners, so we preserve more carbohydrates. So when people chase ketones, the only way that they can then get their ketones up is they have to restrict more and more and more, and they do more and more fasting. They eat less and less. And then, as we know, that comes into a massive problem because you're just not eating enough food. So I think that's the major one is people chasing ketones when they really don't have to. The other one is restricting protein too much, believing that that proteins are bad and they will cause gluconeogenesis and increase your carbohydrates, which I think in anything most people need to increase their protein intake. And then the last one is not shifting the carbohydrates that you do have in your diet around into the right training at the right times. So if you've got say 200 grams to play with during the day, shifting that just after exercise or just before your high intensity training is the way that you would do it.
You're listening to Dr. Dan Plews on episode 352 of the Physical Performance Show, Low Carbohydrate Diet, Right Fuel, Right Time Approach. Support for today's show comes from Polar. Check out the Ignite 3 New Fitness and Wellness Watch. You can find your rhythm with Polar's Ignite 3. It's a combination of stylish look and smart tech for sports and wellness. My wife, Dr. Chris Spear, she is really enjoying the Ignite 3 at the moment. It's a beautiful looking watch, but versatile with its high resolution touchscreen, stunning design, best in class sleep tracking and powerful training tools. Jump over to polar.com. Whilst there, also check out the Polar Pacer Pro, my current running watch. I've never run in a watch that is so light, super responsive with great data display. So jump over to polar.com. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete struggling with tendinopathies such as Achilles tendinopathy, proximal hamstring tendinopathy, or joint-related pain such as patellofemoral or kneecap pain, or bone stress injuries, be that of the tibia, the femur, or the pelvis, then our 45-minute online telehealth consultations can be an ideal vehicle to help get you back to your physical best. Geography is not a boundary when it comes to advising athletes on how to best navigate these conditions. So jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Dan Plews' low carbohydrate diet, right fuel, right time approach. Then sodium ingestion. I was listening to Peter Bruckner back this morning ahead of this episode, as I mentioned, author there once again of A Fat Lot of Good and his transformation with a low carbohydrate lifestyle, which I know we're not strictly talking about today, but he mentioned that when he did shift that way, he found he had to supplement, if you like, or increase his sodium intake because he was having less preserved foods and just getting less sodium on board. It's a big area in endurance sports with lots of differing opinions and beliefs. Is there anything based off what we've discussed today that you think is important or you'd like to share around sodium?
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's actually twofold, Brad. So one is we do. I mean, if you're having less processed foods, your sodium intake is definitely going to be less, which is not a bad thing, right? But it just goes to show how we make things taste good. If you make something sweet and salty, or and carbohydrate and salty, it's quite addictive. It becomes an addictive food, which is why they do it, right? Which is why these industries make so much money from these things. But also, when insulin drops, the kidneys secrete a lot of sodium as well. So in the early stages of a ketogenic diet, suddenly we go from having higher levels of insulin. So insulin is what we need to remove glucose from the blood. Because we're not having as much we're not having as much carbohydrates, so our blood glucose is more stable all the time. We're not needing as much insulin. The kidneys secrete, dump a load of sodium. So we do lose a load of sodium on one side, and we also are taking in less. So in the early stages, like 2 to 3 weeks, you can increase your sodium intake. So general recommended is around 2,000 to 4,000 milligrams per day during that period. Recommended daily allowance is about 2,300 from memory. But one of the interesting things about that, Brad, is that we actually had at AUT University, where I'm a research fellow. We had a student who looked at like the keto flu and this kind of, and the sodium requirements, and it's not lasting. It's not like you have to live that way forever. So it's really during the adaptation phase, like 2 to 3 weeks adaptation, you have to be a bit more aware of it. But then after that, our body's pretty smart, right? It kind of self-regulates and it'll take care of itself. So you don't have to worry about it long term.
Dan, I threw up on the socials that we were recording this today, and not unexpectedly, there have been a bunch of listener questions come through. So if you're okay, I'm going to throw a few your way. Combat Wombat asks,
that is a great name.
Clearly an Australian. Any suggestions on off-the-shelf sports nutrition for athletes with IBS and fructose sensitivity?
Yeah, irritable bowel syndrome. I mean, the only products that I know of is the S-Fuels product. So he should definitely try the Race Plus, and which has got the highly branched cyclic maltodextrin, which is really good on the gut and has no fructose in it. And most people can tolerate that really well. There is, when it comes to irritable bowel syndrome during racing, less is more. If you can train your fat oxidation, think of both sides of the coin. If you can train your fat oxidation during training so you can take less during racing, that will also help a lot. It's often the amount that's the problem.
Daniel Villado from Melbourne, the running DJ, just comments, it's not a question. Dan hosts the Sugar by Half podcast, Peter Bruckner's movement. Looking forward to this one. Great to hear low carb and real foods getting out there more. We are big on a food first approach, and we live a low carb lifestyle, have found better recovery, weight management and performance benefits. That was followed by Try Excel, who asks, looking forward to the show. 2 questions, if I may. 1, what are the key mitigations that you put in place to minimise injury risk without the transition while maximising the benefits? And how do you know when you have optimised fat adaptation?
The comment before of your running guy, I just want to, it made me think of something, that one of the things that I find personally with a lot of my athletes is the ability to tolerate training load when you're burning more fat generally is superior, because if you're considering you're going out on a long low intensity ride and you're burning mostly fats as a fuel, it's easy to replenish the carbohydrates, right? Because you're not using them as much. So, I mean, I've certainly found that my ability to tolerate training, and due to lower inflammation because of less sugar in the diet and less carbohydrates, I think that's one of the main things. So it's something that we haven't discussed, but worth taking note of. In terms of the injury risk, there is a bit more of an injury risk during the early stages of adaptation. So, what we talked about before already with the cold keto phase is that you have to be very particular of the training you're doing during that time. Don't push 2 things at once. Don't go, right, I'm going to increase my training and lower my carbohydrates and go ketogenic all at the same time. Only one side of the experiment, do one thing at a time. Most, like in our course, we generally suggest that you should reduce your training by 50% during those periods, keeping one high intensity session per week, but keeping everything else low intensity, just to keep your glycolysis regulated. So usually it's kind of a short high intensity interval session, like 30 on, 30 off. But that's really important. You have to almost decide, okay, this is 3 weeks, my training is going to suffer, but I'm going to work on my diet. you have to lower the energy out if you're kind of experimenting with what's going in.
Oh, that's such a good point. And I did want to ask that, is there a downside in training performance? And I know you mentioned a few studies there, but thanks, Dan. Jules, fellow Kiwi of yours, asks, do you recommend a low-carb, high-fat adaptation approach in female athletes, or does it depend on the athlete?
Yeah, I mean, I know there's I get this question a lot because there's a bit of a school of thought that low-carb diets aren't for females and they don't work for females, but that's definitely not true. There's individualization in everything that we do. And often the individualization, I think there's differences in males, differences in females. I don't really think it means that it works for males and it doesn't work for females. It definitely works for females because I've seen a number of females who have really strived on this. And there's a number of nutritionists, female nutritionists, Mickey Willardon, Catherine Zinn, who have had massive amounts of success. Merla, who's my Enduro IQ coach, who you met, she's done it and it just changed the way she performs. So, but it just has to be done correctly. It's not whether it works or it doesn't. If it doesn't work, you're just probably not quite doing it right. It's just like altitude. We talk about altitude and we say there's responders and there's non-responders. There is no such thing as a responder and a non-responder. It's just that the people who don't respond have either done too much training at altitude, they've not taken the right supplements at altitude, they've not prepared to go there properly. That's what I think is why it works for some, it doesn't work for others. You just have to find the right combination of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that is for you. But I can guarantee that for most people, a lower approach is always a little bit better than like aiming for 400, 600 grams per day.
And, you mentioned earlier the devil is in the detail and context is king. Shane Rocks asks, Dan, when racing long distances and you can't stomach real food anymore, what are good liquid substitutes?
It depends what you mean by real food. I always find that the little blocks, like chewy blocks, are quite easy to eat. And I know it's food, but it's kind of in between kind of gel and food, and I find they work quite well. Like S Fuels, we have that Race Plus gel. It's very popular and highly palatable. So it's really good. So I'd recommend it gives that a try as well.
Dan, Matt G on Instagram asks, what is the first step? It's a good question to take to be fat adapted for endurance sports, the first step?
Yeah, so it depends on where you are and where you're coming from. I think the really good first step is just actually to do a whole food diet and like almost paleo. You like using the word paleo because it's like, ooh, but at least be mindful of just cutting out the processed foods in your diet. If you can do that, that's a really good first step, and then see how your body responds. And then if that works, then you can look at, reducing your carbohydrates a little bit. I
got an education just being around the Enduro IQ headquarters there for a few days, Dan, around primal and subprimal foods.
Yeah. Bella will educate you on that.
Your gorgeous 3-year-old, 5-year-old daughter, Bella?
Yeah,
she's 5, yeah. Who a lollipop found its way into the house, and you asked primal or subprimal, and the kids declared subprimal.
Yeah, exactly.
It left an impression on me though, Dan. I'm looking at food sources back home now, thinking, okay.
Basically, if you can't hunt it or you can't pull it out of the ground, then don't eat it.
And I know you're a fan of the Liver King as well, obviously in context there. But Ariel Figueroa 77 asks, how many weeks is recommended to work in fat adaptation, and how do you evaluate if the athlete is adapted or not? Thank you, from Argentina.
So most studies are a little bit short. I really believe, and through having done this with thousands of people, a minimum of 12 weeks is necessary. So you've got to be very mindful of where you position this in your training season. So generally, you will have a degradation in your performance. It will go down at the early stages, and it takes about 12 weeks to kind of find your own groove, find the right level of carbohydrates that works for you. 12 weeks is what you need. And to then know if it's working or not, the best, of course, is get in the lab and measure your fat oxidation, measure your maximal fat oxidation and your peak fat oxidation. So maximal fat oxidation is measured in basically how many grams per minute of fats you can oxidize. And then also what's really important is where that sits in terms of your output. So whether it's at 180 watts or is at 260 watts, of course you want that peak fat oxidation to be as close to your race power as possible. That's another measure that you can look at. But if you can't get to the lab, a really good way is just to do long rides with a little bit of glycogen depletion and limiting your carbohydrates and see how long you can go feeling strong for. Generally you'll just find you can go longer and longer, and you don't get, you're not hitting the wall, and you're not having that kind of fatigue creep in as early. That's a very sure and good way to know that you're getting better.
And in the lab, are there any protocols that you would suggest, or that's just highly variable depending on the athlete, their background?
We do this a lot, and we wrote a paper on it. It was published in the Journal of Frontiers with my colleague Edmonda as the lead author on that. And generally we do 3-minute stages, and measure, 3-minute stages incremental. You don't have to go to max. You really have to go to, you only have to go to your anaerobic threshold, because after that, the VCO2 and the VO2, the numbers aren't as good anymore, just because of the acidosis and the increase in VCO2 blowing off and exhaled. So, you really only have to go to the anaerobic threshold, and, 3-minute stages is enough. You don't want to go too long, because the longer you go, the more it's going to increase your fat oxidation anyway. So that's the way that we do it, from fasted generally as well, to keep that control, because what you eat before also affects. If you want to do test and retest, you want to keep that quite tight.
Thanks, Dan. Inner Wish asks, and I know you've touched on this, will low-carb diets compromise endurance performance in female endurance athletes, and why does my performance suffer when I go on a low-carb diet? But I think by default, you may have already picked that up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I recommend that you just take another look, and you're probably just missing a few little bits and pieces, or not giving it long enough. Dan, final 2 questions here. Philon97 on Instagram, an Irish triathlete. It's quite a detail-specific question. Here it is. I listened recently to the Scientific Triathlon show episode with Dr. Andy Blow. He talked about how athletes were surprised by the cold temperatures in St. George for the 70.3 World Champs. He talked about how little fluid, and thus carbohydrate, Emma Pallant consumed through the race, 28 grams an hour. He wasn't quite able to explain why she performed so well with a strong finish to overtake Lucy Charles. He attributed this to her grit and self-motivation. My thinking is different though, considering the effect of the temperature on the sympathetic activation and fuel partitioning. Dr. Plews showed with Jeff Rothschild that high temperatures promote significantly higher carbohydrate oxidation during heavy exercise. Could very low temperatures potentially result in very low sympathetic activation and higher fat oxidation? Should we tailor athletes' carbohydrate intake based on the race day temperature? Could we enhance training for fat oxidation by exercising in cold or using cold baths after long endurance fasted sessions? An ergogenic effect through PPAR-Y. I would love to hear Dr. Plews' thoughts on that topic. Now, that is a very detailed and specific question. My take on that is that often, and I've written about this so much, is less is more. And if you take so much carbohydrate on, it can affect your ability to absorb it. And I think that sometimes, if you take on a bit less, you actually absorb a little bit more, and it's better for you. I mean, whether the cold specifically in that acute setting is actually doing anything, I'm not so sure. He's right. It was actually me. It wasn't Jeff Rothschild's paper. It was me and Ed Maunda. We showed that during when it gets hot, you do increase your carbohydrate oxidation, specifically when you go above your aerobic threshold. But I don't think it's really being shown in the cold acutely. But what we do know is that if you expose yourself to cold temperatures a lot, like cold baths, there's potential that it can increase your amount of brown fat tissue. So brown fat tissue there's different types of fat that we have on the body. One of them is brown fat, and the reason that we're more interested in brown fat is because brown fat is more mitochondrial rich. So if you increase your numbers of brown fat, your basic metabolic rate will increase. More mitochondria. It's a powerhouse of the cell, which means we have better ability to burn fuels. One of them, of course, is fat. So which is why that people can often lose weight. They do a lot of cold water immersion because they increase their brown fat, they increase their mitochondria, their resting metabolic rate increases. So there could be a little bit of truth in that in a chronic level, but I'm not so sure that it might happen on a such an acute level. Even though if it depends, if resting heart rates, if the heart rates are a bit lower and there is less sympathetic drive, it may be, because we know that the sympathetic drive, it can downregulate your fat oxidation a little bit.
So that ice bath at Endura IQ headquarters is there for a reason, increasing the brown fat?
Yeah. I mean, it could be one of them. I mean, the main reason I do it is more for like the cognitive side, like the mood, the lifting serotonin and dopamine specifically. That's the main reason I use it.
Dan, final question. I think you'll enjoy this one. This comes from fellow Kiwi Ironman triathlete Tim, who asks, several weeks out from Ironman New Zealand, what's Dan's prediction for his own time?
Yeah, good question. I don't know really. I mean, I'm definitely not. It's been a very short build. I'd be happy with anything under 9 hours. I think with such a short build, we'll see how we go. You never know what the weather's going to be like, right?
Well, that's what Tim commented. The weather will play a big part. Dan, yes, you are in a big training block. I know you've done some big hours recently off a relatively shorter preparation, I guess, than usual for you. So do appreciate you carving out time. As we record, this is actually on a Sunday.
Yeah, exactly. I've just remembered the physiology. So when you're, it's non-esterified fatty acids for the when you get hot, the increase in sympathetic activity increases non-esterified fatty acids, which can decrease your fat metabolism. There you go.
There we go. Full stop. Dan, and it's a quick question from myself. Continuous glucose monitoring devices like Super Sapiens, commercial device. We recently featured some of the team on an expert edition. I guess there's potentially a good role for that while people are looking at improving their fat oxidation.
Yeah, I think there is for sure. Like it's all about the context of what you use it in. I mean, it can be really, the question around how you can tell if you're improving your fat oxidation or not, particularly if you're doing kind of your zone 2, level 2 endurance rides. If you're maintaining more stable blood glucose for longer periods of time, it can be a good sign that you're improving your fat oxidation, provided that you're keeping the fueling the same. So if you're quite control, you eat the same the night before, the same the morning of, and then you do like a 2-hour ride at say 200 watts and see how your blood glucose stabilization changes. In the early stages, you might see quite a significant drop or a steeper slope. Super Sapiens will actually calculate the slope for you now post-exercise if you sync it with your Garmin, and then you can tell over time if you're improving, because theoretically if you're improving your fat oxidation, that slope should become less steep.
So there is a role for that emerging technology, but once again, as you say, context is everything. Dan, you've been very generous with your time and as always your knowledge and expertise. As you know, there's always a physical challenge that our experts espouse for the week ahead. What is Dr. Dan Plews' physical challenge going to be to the listeners?
I think the physical challenge this time we can have, just try when you next do your long endurance ride, just try and manipulate your carbohydrate a little bit and do it in a more of a glycogen depleted state. So refrain from carbohydrates the night before, don't have them in the morning, proteins and fats, proteins and a coffee, and then you have one bottle of just electrolytes, and try and just have that for the first couple of hours and then switch to your carbohydrates as a light introduction for you.
So the long ride or long session challenge.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dan Plews, and we wish you all the best for the Ironman just several weeks away.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
So there you have it, another expert edition of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know that you enjoyed Dr. Dan Plews' sharings once again. Now remember, as I said at the top of the show, if you'd like to learn more about this big topic and gain further insight into how to apply this to your training world and lifestyle, then take advantage of EndurIQ's offer. Jump over to EndurIQ.com, register for LTD 101, the practical application of low carbohydrate performance for long distance triathlon, use the code ENDUREIQ TPPS, all one word in capitals, ENDUREIQ TPPS, and the team will give you free access to LDT 201, their online heart rate variability course. A massive thanks to the team who have made this show possible from day one, all the way through to our recent bronze medal at the Australian Podcast Awards in the sports category. Daryl Misson, audio engineer, Susan Wilkinshaw, administration, Matthew Olding, show graphic design, and recently Milan Borrow, videography. If you're yet to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can jump over there and now find video episodes. A huge thanks to those leaving ratings and reviews over on Spotify or iTunes. If you've been enjoying the show, then please consider taking a moment to drop a review. We see those coming through, and they are always a lot of fun, and they're encouraging as well. So thanks to those that have left ratings and reviews in recent times. Big thanks also, of course, to our show patrons. If you'd like to support the production of the show practically, you can do so from just $5 per month. Jump over to Patreon, search the Physical Performance Show, and there you can pledge your support. Now, in return, we will grant you complimentary access to our live stream back catalogue, including live streams with Dr. Stephen Seiler, Dr. Shona Halson on recovery, Rinny McGregor on nutrition and fueling, and most recently, Rory Darkins on sports psychology. And upcoming in early 2023, we are pleased to announce that the Norwegian triathlon lead coach and exercise scientist, the most downloaded guest of the Physical Performance Show to date, Olav Alexander Boo, will be presenting a live stream event with more details to come. Thanks as always for those posting podsies. That's a screenshot of the episode that you've enjoyed at any given moment and tagging in the show at Physical Performance Show over on the socials. You'll find myself over there at Brad_Beer. Please feel free to reach out with any feedback regarding the show, or perhaps you have a guest recommendation. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we're jumping over to an expert edition with Kevin Wernley, who's recently completed a PhD looking at the role of movement with respect to lower back pain. Now, 8 out of 10 people will experience debilitating lower back pain through their life, and athletes are not exempt. And Kevin will explain next week why it is that breaking the societal beliefs around good posture may be the very ticket to helping people overcome their back pain. It's a fascinating expert edition. Be sure to be tuning in to an all-important topic. Until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this is the award-winning Physical Performance Show.